Brassfacts here with a Pepsi Nitro. Yeah, it's the good stuff. For longtime viewers of the channel, you know I like to occasionally dabble in predictive, guesswork autism to provide structure to my preparedness plan. You should probably watch part 1 through 3 of this series. I'll link it down in the description, where I talk about things that are very much more likely by several orders of magnitude versus what I will discuss today. You should focus on those first, but here we go. This video isn't to say that if a government collapse occurred in the United States, it would occur this way, or that this is even likely to occur here or even elsewhere. Instead, this is one of my many videos where I discuss a slight possibility, because that's ultimately what preparedness is. Preparing is the assumption that something might happen, and that if we cover enough of our bases, that when a dart of fate is thrown at the dartboard, it'll land on something we're semi-familiar with and we can deal with. Thinking through potential scenarios in a semi-logical fashion to expose gaps in our capability, even if those events range in likelihood, allow for us to be more flexible and capable of being a prepared citizen. So once again, I stress, we're preparing or talking about something here today that is very unlikely. Thus, if you're just starting out on preparedness, I would focus on the more likely scenarios that I've discussed previously. I'm also going to use the phrase partial collapse state. This is not actually really a real term. It's a descriptor, right? But it's not a term that's truly defined. The closest term that I've seen in poli-sci is generally more failed state and collapsed state. But that's not really what I'm after. Also, you've already heard me use the word state a lot. For some Americans, this might be confusing. Unless I specify otherwise, state in terms of academia or political science refers to Germany, France, United States, Russia. That is a state. Unless specified, and I will specify, state in this context doesn't mean Utah, California, etc. It's a weird inconsistency of poli-sci verbiage. So yeah, sorry, kind of have to live with it. Anyway, the topic at hand, partial collapse of a government. This can entail many different aspects, but I'm going to focus on the scenario where the government continues to exist in name and function, but operates at a significantly reduced capacity, thus partial collapse. This is a very interesting topic, as this is studied quite extensively in my degree, political science, and we have and yes, I have 2 degrees, would not recommend. We have a fairly wide pool of real-world examples to draw from. Unfortunately though, because this topic is hard to be objective about, almost no one agrees what exactly constitutes failed governments. And there are just as many definitions or theories as there are cases. But common themes do exist. We can get a rough feel for what has previously constituted a partially or fully failed government. While these aren't necessarily objective quantifiers, we can get a rough idea of what we might see should we apply these scenarios over to the United States. I'm going to keep this very surface level because otherwise this video will be 3 hours long minimum and you still won't be all that much more informed. I recommend, if you are interested in this kind of thing, if this interests you, look up terms like stability index, check out low stability index versus high stability index nations, overlap murder rates, overlap legitimacy of government, democracy indexes. Combine that all together and you can kind of begin to maybe sort of see what we're getting at here today. Take it with a grain of salt. I don't like some of those indexes at all. But broadly speaking, getting into it, there are several key signs that a government is beginning to fail, has partially failed, or is completely in the gutter. All of these aspects, of course, play off of each other, and while some do lead to another, they also lead back to each other in a feedback spaghetti loop of interconnectivity. One of the big ones that is often cited in the preparedness community is loss of rule of law, WROL for nut and fancyism. Go ahead and attach partial in front of everything I'll discuss here today, because if this was complete loss of rule of law, we'd be talking about failed states, and that's not what we're doing. We're talking about partial loss of rule of law. This one's fairly well understood, as mentioned. It occurs when the risk-reward matrix of following the law widely swings to another side, and while most people will still continue to follow the law, the elements on the fringes, the disenfranchised grouped, or simply criminals, begin to view the risk-reward for breaking the law as suddenly working out. This causes massive strain on the system, bringing it to, or perhaps even past, the breaking point. We saw some of this with the George Floyd riots. A very, very small percentage of the population said, fuck it. Relatively speaking, this light civil unrest, and it was clear that the apparatus of law enforcement was struggling to handle these minor flare-ups. Now multiply this to extremes and you can see the issues that may occur. Like many things in society, currency, jobs, standardized time, the law, and more collectively require everyone to play along at the same time, and it does have benefits to being played along with. However, as soon as these benefits begin to fade or the risk-reward kind of goes out of vogue, you begin to have people that no longer buy into these concepts and do their own thing, and you get the wholesale collapse of the system, the loss of rule of law. But why would people abandon the rule of law beyond just a risk-reward? Well, one of the things that might occur is loss in legitimacy, or loss in legitimacy of government. This is far more important than many people might imagine. Even in dictator systems, where you need a high degree of legitimacy to function. This is academically often called the mandate to rule. And it's why democratic systems tend to actually outlast other government types. Single-party system or single-entity system has a downturn, you often get a coup d'etat, which replaces the government wholesale. However, with most democratic systems, you have built-in mechanisms to change government and to refresh the legitimacy or refresh the mandate to rule. Trying to keep it not political here, but the country could handle 8 years of Obama. Could we handle 30 years? Probably not. That doesn't just apply to him, right? Could we have handled 16 years of Bush Sr.? No, we couldn't have. Right? But the democratic system has a way to refresh the mandate to rule, and every time we get a new president, it typically starts out with higher than average popularity, and then that goes down over time. But even in systems like democracies or democratic type systems, with these safeguards, we can still have issues with the legitimacy of rule or the mandate to rule, and that typically comes with distrust in the system itself, not what the system is doing, right? And we've seen the beginnings of this in the last presidential election, and just confidence in government in general. Switching gears, we can talk more about issues that precipitate from lack of funding and resources, which is very common in a failing system. One of the most popular cited indicator of government failings is loss of monopoly of violence in certain areas. Monopoly of violence implies or describes the government's ability to win any fight, anywhere, at nearly any time, within a reasonable time frame. We're not talking within days or sometimes even weeks, but if you put a flag down at some point in, the United States and call it the nation of brassfacts, eventually you'll be told to knock it the fuck off under the threat of violence. And that violence is absolutely not a bluff, and you will lose that fight. Now, it doesn't mean this occurs regularly, but the threat of violence is well known enough that no new countries, organizations, or even entities challenge the state at the highest tier, because they know maybe they'll get away with it short term, but eventually the hammer always comes, and no one wins that fight. If we notice areas within the state that is lacking this monopoly of violence, or we notice third-party actors or even non-state actors emerge, well, that is a very, very strong indication of a failing government. As imagined, the loss and monopoly of violence almost always results in increased violence due to the nature of it, which leads to a host of other issues: loss of legitimacy, loss of rule of law, and the next topic, loss in sovereignty. The sovereignty is kind of the crux of why the above features matter. I didn't mention all the features, right? This video can't be that long, but I mentioned some core ones that we can look at. Sovereignty itself is defined as a complete or near complete control within the borders defined of the nation. Sovereignty is defined by the aspects I've mentioned above. You need monopoly of violence, you need legitimacy, you need rule of law, and more. Without these, it's almost impossible to have or maintain sovereignty. As an aside, you also need a powerful nation and military to resist sovereignty incursions by other states, different countries, but we're going to leave that out because we're looking in the state, or in the country right now. Once you lose the above in meaningful quantities, the ability of the state to impose its will upon its territory degrades or depletes. Some of you might view this as, okay, yeah, the will of the state is laws. But that's actually not all that it is. It's a big component, but will of the state also includes utilities, stability, resources, food, water, movement of commerce, property rights, the list goes on. All of this is included under the will of the state. One of the main aspects of the government's will is society, in its image, obviously. So we tie it all together and we can describe this as partial failure of the government. The government still exists, the government still works, but it's working at a reduced capacity due to whatever reasons. This might be controversial, but I'm going to use Mexico as a good example of this in action. Mexico is a very interesting case because it is not only widely debated, but it's absolutely not a failed state. But we're seeing a lot of cracks and issues discussed thus far showing up in this country that has all the hallmarks on the surface of being a functional society. They have modern technology, a large homogeneous population that actually believe in the concept of the nation of Mexico. It's also technically a democracy. It's bordered by the most powerful nation on earth, so it's not even fearful of being invaded. But we look at Mexico and we notice non-insignificant swaths of Mexico are not governed completely by the federal government. And even larger sections are kind of contested areas between a government and a different entity, say a gang, cartel, or a hybrid organization. While the Mexican government is undoubtedly the strongest single entity, compared to the aggregate, it's stretched so thin and compromised to the point where rule of law, monopoly of violence, and more are so skewed in some areas that we're seeing non-state actors exist with semi-impunity for years and decades on end without repercussion. Now don't get me wrong, Mexico is not a Somalia. It's barely dipping its toes into partial failed status, but it is dipping its toes into it. And unlike other countries that we could reference that are far more progressed in this partial failed status, Mexico is interesting because, as mentioned, it has a lot of hallmarks of what should be a stable country, right? Thus, we can use Mexico as like kind of a litmus test or a canary in the coal mine for what we might observe early on in the United States should we follow in a similar path. So what would happen if we applied this to the United States partially or fully? What would a partially failed government look like in the United States? It's worth stating or noting, I think the United States is actually still very far away from a failed condition state, and we still have it very good. But that could easily change, and for sure the bedrock does have the beginnings of cracks and compromises that we're only one or two bad situations away from us sliding down a similar slope. However, it's worth noting what I'm going to describe is going to be fairly extreme, and more realistic cases will likely be what I described, but rolled back a little, right? Not nearly as hardcore, but if we prepare and talk about the worst case scenario, we have a good understanding of how to deal with the less extremes versions of what I described. I want to address balkanization, because that's often quoted as a US end condition, which is the result of a partially failed central government combined with a state that is fragmented into multiple nations. And perhaps this could occur in the United States, but at this time or even ever, I don't think the conditions exist for balkanization. The United States is very much one nation, as much as that is debated, so we can't really fragment in the way described in balkanization. However, the collapse or extreme weakening of the US government is entirely possible. We've seen the beginnings of this potentially play out. Federal government failure would likely involve the retrenchment of federal assets to focus on more critical aspects, while leaving other stuff to the state. We'd see weakened states try to pick up the slack, and the void left by the federal government. While some states are absolutely better equipped to manage themselves and even have surplus, the result in a scenario like this is largely going to be the same, but just on a miserable slider. The states and the governments were built on an era of excess, so when we remove this excess, which is likely what's going to precipitate weak government, a lot of this is going to be crumbling down. And it's very likely we'll see states focus on the core and then leaving out the less important areas within their borders as they try to maximize their own resources. Looking at several examples, we can kind of guess what this might look like. Keeping it broad stroke, society is still going to function. Most people cannot just fuck off to the countryside and just wait for it to all blow over because A, it's probably not going to blow over, and B, the systems that exist now will continue to exist, and those are very city-centric. In fact, in countries that we see are collapsing actually become more city-centric as time goes on, even though it's sort of a hellscape at that point. We'll see incredible disenfranchisement because the government is no longer able to provide what it used to, and even though a lot of times we see welfare programs, the reality is the government can't actually afford these welfare programs. You combine with the fact that because the state, the nation state, and the state, so, Utah, are kind of retrenching and focusing their efforts on more critical components, we'll see a lot of areas that just don't even rate for the state or the government. Thus, you'll see even more disenfranchisement because why pay taxes for an entity that no longer serves me, right? So we're going to see a lot of disenfranchisement. We're also going to see, partially as a result, incredibly elevated levels of violence, both random targeting and more due to the partial loss of rule of law and all that comes with it. So think not only random muggings, robbery daylights, and more, but also organized criminal activity, we've seen this, but at a higher level, gang wars, turf wars, and the targeting of individuals. We're also going to see a lot of terroristic type activities because alongside government weakening, we're going to see political activity, right? We're going to see those executing in terroristic type activities to send a political message or pressure or whatever you want to call it. Violence towards ideological or race type. So think spurious or semi-spurious or even organized violence targeted towards those with different skin colors, different cultures, or even in some cases, targeting of those that work for certain entities. So think LEO, military, government employees, or whatever, or simply targeting those that are rich, not to rob, but to send a message, right? Class warfare, I guess. All the while, the quality of living, your income, your ability to do things will be heavily impacted. You're going to have less money and less tools to mitigate the issues described in this potential scenario. So when we look and finally get into the video, in dealing with these situations, at the base level, you gotta be, I fucking hate this term because it's been brutalized, but you gotta be the gray man. It very much applies here because you need to sterilize your outward appearance and minimize yourself as a target. This is critically important because this event that I'm describing here, more than any other event I've described thus far, except, day-to-day living, is not a flash in a pan. It's a new reality. This isn't 2 months, 6 months, or even a year of high intensity, but 5 years plus, or maybe even potentially the rest of your life. You need to minimize complexity and maximize sustainability on how you approach certain problem sets. Yeah, short term, it'd be pretty fucking cool to have a full team and full drip nods and act as a QRF. But does that really function in real life when everyone has to make money, where money is worth not very much? No, it doesn't. You're going to need to minimize the likelihood of critical events by smart route planning, situational awareness, minimizing of signature, and more. The term often used, you just need street smarts. You need to act street smart. That is mostly a giving, and most people understand that in this community. So moving on, even the most gray of gray men will potentially end up in some form of conflict at some point, depending on where you are at. And because everyone functionally lives in the shitty part of the neighborhood, because the whole country is now the shitty part of the neighborhood, even a low chance occurrence stretched out day after day, year after year, and even decade after decade, suddenly goes from a low percentage chance on a short time scale to a likelihood on a long time scale. So what are we going to do to deal with these situations that may occur from the tactical side of things? We'll get the PDW out of the way. Everyone's sick of the word PDW. I know, I get it, but I'll quickly mention it. PDW can do a lot of heavy lifting here because you are trying to engage in your day-to-day activities. Thus, you have the ability to carry a more capable weapon system while you do all the things you continue to do. You can solve a lot, and you should aim to solve a lot of your problems with your handgun. It should be your go-to. But a weapon like a Flux Raider, TP9, US, or whatever, you've heard it a million times, can be on-body concealed and deployed in similar times to a handgun, assuming the appropriate system. You get more rounds on target, more accurately, and faster, with larger magazine size. That is not insignificant, especially when the likelihood of multi-hostile actors is not only likely, but probable. You combine that with the inverse, the penalties of skylining yourself with a visible weapon, and the dire consequences that come with it, not just skylining yourself against gangs, organized crime, or targeted crime, but also the government that will likely be cracking down on weapon ownership. I don't really see a rifle functioning as a primary option in the I'm away from home context. Right? So, square away your pistol, maybe consider a PDW. If you can fit a rifle in the car, cool. However, when we move closer to our home and maybe our community, that's when tactical gear, finally, for really the first time in the series I'm doing, really begins to start making sense. You have the very real possibility of actually needing to support your home or community against a large determined attackers, plural. Backing up for a second, if we look in other type of communities, and other nations specifically that are going through this right now or have gone through this, we're seeing some of the difficulty here. We hear plenty of stories where homes just get overrun, families, we'll just say wrecked, not to be too graphic. However, conversely, we also hear success stories in like South Africa, South America, where rich communities get bypassed due to having, functionally speaking, mercenary groups being able to protect them. And often it's only 2 to 5 guys pulling security in a rotating fashion. But often enough, this is enough to either ward off an attack or simply be bypassed. Now, most of us can't afford a small mercenary group to protect us, but the benefits of a community is that a small group of armed rotating men can be at least moderately effective in emulating this. At the baseline, even one person providing early warning and intel is invaluable. I foresee, potentially as the nation and state begin to collapse, we're going to see new communities form up to try to do exactly this. And while most of this task will be solved by light, low-key kit, smaller weapons, soft armor, basic radios, the ability to don a lot of gear and reinforce the on-duty group with a off-duty group with heavy kit, night vision, and rifles could potentially act as an extreme force multiplier to defend a community long-term in a society where the rule of law is degraded and you cannot rely on police even showing up at all. Here is where working on basic small unit tactics and specifically communication will pay dividends, because we're only the hero in our own story. Even well-equipped groups can often get mowed down by the violence of action and the speed of events like this occurring. I know most of you guys have seen this on, formerly Live Leak, sometimes YouTube and other channels, where even a good defending force with well-equipped stuff just gets utterly thrashed by just a rapidly moving forward. So speaking of organization, if there ever was a time where quality comms are mandatory or a requirement, this is probably it. While cell phones are stupidly reliable right now as a communication device, this may not be the case in the future due to outages or potentially even jamming. We've actually observed this. It doesn't mean radios are impervious to this either, but they certainly do have a wider margin of operations. Even on the non-tactical side, we can see stuff like basically just passing around basic intel, like, hey, there's construction on 4th, you should probably avoid it if you don't want to get held up, right? Or passing around information that, hey, there's a strange group of dudes coming down Main Street. Be careful, they might be moving your way, right? Stuff like that. Okay, so there are certainly more things I could talk about on the tactical side of the pie. On the non-tactical side of things, much like most things, the preparedness is dominated by the non-tactical slice of the pie. It's worth noting, in these types of events, partial government collapse would certainly not happen in isolation. If the government is low on cash, then that means the tax base is also low on cash. We've seen super wealthy nations end up in this situation very rapidly, be it due to rapid changes into policy, be it like Venezuela, forced political and social switch-ups like South Africa, and generally most of the time, all of the above. The usual stuff to prepare for here is present. Food, water, preps, the ability to function when the power is out, the ability to keep your car gassed up, the list goes on. I don't want this video to mirror previous episodes because prepping is very much a progressive thing. You build on your capability in a ever-increasing manner, and you can flex that capability into different scenarios, like this scenario. So a lot of what I'm going to say here, if I did say them, would repeat what I've said in other videos. So I'm going to focus on solutions or requirement unique to this specific scenario discussed thus far. A big one I want to focus on is going to be community. One of the best things out of the gate, more than any preps, beyond the basics, is having a strong, resilient career that isn't easily replaced. Ironic coming from a YouTuber making videos on a channel that doesn't want him to make those types of videos. But have a game plan, move up the retirement date, have excess cash, no debt, and more. Getting out of the hot zone cities or whatever may be the only even partially winning move. But I think this is something well understood in this community, so I don't want to harp on it too much. It's the dream, right? We all have that to a certain degree. But for most of us, however, this is not an option because the reality is this system is built around cities. Not everyone can disconnect from that. Actually, the majority of us cannot disconnect from that. In that context, even if you are in a city, I would begin by building a community, and that's what I'm going to focus on here. Because no matter how good you are with guns or how many MREs you bought for $14.99, you're going to struggle. Personally, for me, try to start with the basics. Get a good training regime, both tactical, preparedness, and whatever, going for yourself. And once you figure out your own shit, you can find a training partner or like a partner in crime, and then another, and then another. And as soon enough, you're going to have a core small team. But it's not just about firearms. But those that train in the martial use of firearms generally are also on board preparedness, so it's a good litmus test to kind of get those people together. Before you know it, you're going to have a very squared away support structure. They don't even need to be, in the same house, though that is certainly beneficial. But the ability to have a support structure, not just for guns, but other things, is critical. From there, or simultaneously even, you should start talking to some of your neighbors. I get it. Trust me, I get it. I've lived in a city of 5,000 for a good percentage of my life, and then moving to a big city and trying to talk with neighbors is 10 times harder because there is absolutely an expectation in a lot of big cities that you're simply to leave each other alone. Ultimately, your goal isn't to know everyone, just some key people here or there, enough to kind of understand the lay of the land. And if things get worse, and as the innate human desire to form a community kind of comes up as times get hard, well, you've already have some of those connections there, and you also have your little team, and this gives you a lot of flexibility and more. A lot of people are really, myself included, are very oriented around surviving in a small isolated group, but in this scenario that goes on for basically forever with an existing government, you want to at least try to thrive. And as you imagine, you're going to need to have a smallish or large community, and you cannot expect that to naturally form or fall into your lap. You got to kind of take charge. It's also important to know who lines up with your ethos and who doesn't line up with your ethos, because trusting people is going to be critically important, especially when ratting people out to the government is going to be more and more prevalent. I'll leave that part at that. Regardless, the key to partial government collapse or failure is combining all the things I mentioned thus far into a singular thing, and understanding that it's actually not that complex, but simultaneously it's very difficult. You're going to have a very wide threat index, but you're also going to have to understand that life does go on. We're going to go from wanting to deal with, maybe organized group to potentially full-blown non-state actors. Anyways, thanks for watching. I hope this was somewhat useful. More so to get your mind turning, the gears going, versus being a concrete policy prescription on what to do for this scenario. Regardless, as usual, thanks for watching. Yada, yada, yada. You know the YouTube things. See ya, bye.